Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're taking a deep dive today into the world of business process mapping with this book I've got right here, Business Process Mapping, Improving Customer Satisfaction. It's by J. Mike Jacka and Paulette J. Keller. We talk a lot on the show about improving efficiency and finding opportunities for improvement, and this is kind of like that, but for businesses.
It's interesting you should say that. It's almost like creating a storyboard for a movie.
Oh, I like that.
But instead of scenes, we're mapping out each step of a business process. And that helps us find those hidden inefficiencies.
I see.
And also any places where we could make things better.
Cool. So today it's kind of like the listener sitting down with J. Mike Jacka and Paulette J. Keller themselves
Right.
and getting a guided tour of their insights.
Exactly.
And real-world examples. I'm excited to jump in. Chapter 1 is called, what is this thing called? Process mapping.
A lot of times people think that business process mapping is this rigid corporate chore,
Yeah.
but it's really about understanding the journey of a process.
Right.
It's about seeing how each step along the way contributes to the bigger picture.
Okay, so how do we actually apply that to a business?
Well, Jack and Keller use a really brilliant analogy in Chapter 1, the story of Pinocchio. Just like Geppetto takes a piece of wood and turns it into a puppet, a business process takes some kind of input, transforms it through steps, and then you get a valuable output.
So the wood is the input and the puppet is the output.
Uh-huh.
And all that carving and the painting and the assembling, that's the process.
Exactly. And Pinocchio's journey isn't just about Pinocchio. It's about the other characters he meets along the way and the challenges they face together. And so it is with business process mapping. It's not just about the individual tasks. It's about understanding how all those tasks fit together.
That makes a lot of sense. I think for someone who's never actually done process mapping before, though, I'm still a little bit confused on how you break it down.
Oh, okay.
Like, how do we break down a process into those individual steps?
The authors actually give a really simple, relatable example. They talk about making breakfast,
Okay.
and they break it down into units, like prepare ingredients,
Okay.
cook ingredients, serve ingredients.
Makes sense.
And then each of those units is broken down into tasks like fry bacon, toast bread, and then each of those tasks is broken down into even smaller actions like pour mixture when you're making scrambled eggs.
Wow. So even something as simple as making breakfast can be broken down into so many steps.
Right.
I can see now how you could really use that to uncover hidden complexities in a business process.
Absolutely. And you remember the Greenies example from the book? It shows how what employees actually do when they're doing a process can be different than what the official procedure says they should be doing.
Right.
So by understanding the nuance, you can map the process more accurately and you can find places to improve.
Right. So it's not just about what's written down.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how it's actually happening in the real world, which I think is a really valuable insight. Now, something that stood out to me was how process mapping can actually boost employee morale.
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting.
It's like when employees understand how all of their tasks fit together, they feel a sense of pride and ownership over their work.
Yeah, and they can see how their work adds value to the bigger picture.
Yeah. So we've established the what of process mapping, but I'm curious about how we decide which processes to map in the first place. I think that's where Chapter 2 comes in, identifying processes to map.
You got it. And this is where we switch our perspective. Instead of looking from the company's view, we start looking from the customer's view.
Interesting.
Jacka and Keller actually introduced this concept of moments of truth,
Moments of truth. Okay.
which are those crucial interactions a customer has that form their opinion of a company.
I see. It's like those first impressions. You know, they can make or break a relationship.
Yeah,
But in this case, it's the relationship between the company and its customer.
exactly. And they use a great example, the cell phone customer interaction process.
Okay.
They break it down into scenes. Seeing an advertisement, making inquiries about the phones, deciding to actually buy a phone and a plan, getting support, paying your bill, even what happens if you want to end your service.
So each scene is a moment of truth where the customer is evaluating the company. And if even one of those scenes goes wrong, it could totally affect their perception of the whole company.
Right. And it's not just about the big, obvious interactions. Do you remember Outtake 2 from the book?
Yes.
It's a story about how something as small as a data entry mistake can turn into this huge customer service disaster.
That was wild. And it shows how mapping those invisible processes, the ones that don't seem that important, can be so crucial for customer satisfaction.
Yeah, and it's all about understanding those pain points and then figuring out how to address them before they become a problem.
I'm starting to get how this all connects now. So we've identified the process we want to map, we've considered the customer's journey, and now we're ready to roll up our sleeves and get to work. What's next? Before we get started mapping, we need to do our research. That's Chapter 3, Information Gathering.
Okay.
It's all about laying the groundwork. Jackett and Keller say we have to do thorough research.
It reminds me of when they make a historical movie.
Okay.
The researchers have to make sure every single detail is accurate. You wouldn't want a spaceship in a sci-fi film that defies the laws of physics.
That's a great point. If you start with inaccurate information, you're going to end up with an inaccurate map.
Right, which wouldn't help anybody.
Right. The book actually talks about some key tools for gathering information, like the process description overview, the process profile worksheet, and workflow surveys.
Of those, the process profile worksheet seems pretty useful to me.
It is.
It's like a blueprint for understanding the process.
It is. It breaks the process down into sections, like, the name of the process, who owns it, what are the objectives and the risks, what are the key controls, how will we measure success. And the book gives us this great example with the expense payment process.
Right, and the reviewer asked all these great questions about the objectives and the controls of the process and ended up uncovering all these areas for potential improvement.
Exactly. And that's what makes the process profile worksheet so useful. It makes you think critically about the process.
Okay, so we've gathered all this information, we've analyzed the process, now we're finally ready to start mapping right.
We are. Chapter 4, Interviewing and Map Generation, is where the action starts.
Oh, fun.
It's about talking to the people who actually do the process every day and getting their firsthand accounts of what's working, what's not working.
So it's kind of like interviewing the actors on a movie set.
Yeah, you're trying to understand how they do their jobs, their motivations, their challenges. And the authors talk about how important it is to use really clear communication when you're doing these interviews.
Okay.
They recommend using sticky notes to keep things flexible because you might need to adjust the map as you go along.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like building a puzzle where the people you're interviewing are kind of your guides.
Exactly. And the book gives a lot of good tips about representing the flow of the process visually and how to represent those decision points using diagrams.
Exhibit 4.1 is helpful. It gives really clear visual examples for beginners.
It does. And do you remember the claim office XYZ example?
Uh-huh.
It walked us through creating a process map for handling customer claims, and it showed how there were all these handoffs between the customer, the agent, and the receptionist.
Yeah, and those little inefficiencies add up.
They do, and it all goes back to those moments of truth we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it's like a domino effect, where one small hiccup can trigger a whole chain reaction of delays and frustrations.
That's exactly right. And that's why process mapping is so important. It lets you zoom in and see those little places where you can make a big difference.
Okay, so we've mapped out the process, we've identified some areas for improvement. What happens next?
Well, now we have to analyze what we've found. And chapters 5 and 7, map generation example and map analysis example, take us through the process of moving from creating a detailed map to actually pulling insights out of that map.
And we're going to use our trusty old expense payment process for this, right?
Of course. The book breaks it down into units like prepare request, prepare check, and deliver check. And then it breaks it down even further into smaller tasks and actions. And Exhibit 5.7 focuses on the verify request action and shows how you can see things like batch processing and waiting times, which are causing bottlenecks in the process.
I'm starting to see that it's the little things like that that cause huge delays.
It really is. And it's so important to look back at your original objectives, risks, and controls and see how the process you've mapped might not actually be meeting its intended goals.
It's like checking your map against a compass to make sure you're still on course.
Exactly.
But what happens if we get off track? What are some common mistakes that people make when they're doing process mapping?
That's a great question. And that leads us right into Chapter 8, Pitfalls and Traps.
Oh.
It's like a guide to help you avoid all the common mistakes.
Okay, I like that. It's like one of those signs on the highway that warns you about dangerous conditions.
Yeah. And one of the biggest pitfalls is mapping for mapping's sake. Just creating detailed maps with no real plan of action.
Right. It's like drawing a beautiful storyboard and never actually making the movie.
Exactly. And they also talk about getting lost in the details, missing the forest for the trees.
Right.
And also penmanship counts because even if your map is just a rough draft, it still needs to be legible.
That makes sense. If no one can understand your map, what's the point of even making it?
Right. And they touch on some other things like flow-leading questions and failing to verify facts.
It's a good checklist for anyone who wants to make sure that their process mapping is successful. Now, I want to switch gears and talk about something that I found really interesting. Chapter 9, Customer Mapping. How does that fit into all this?
Customer mapping is a tool that you use along with process mapping, but it really focuses on understanding the customer journey.
Yep.
It's about putting yourself in the customer's shoes and seeing the process from their point of view.
So it's like having a camera with two lenses.
Okay.
One lens is looking at the internal workings of the business,
Uh-huh.
and the other lens is showing you how the customer sees the process.
Exactly. The book outlines the core steps, like defining the customer's job to be done, identifying what tasks they have to do, what inputs and outputs are involved, and how we'll measure success. And they use this obtained training example to illustrate how a customer might navigate this process and where the company might be falling short.
Right. And the We Train You case study was a great example.
Sally was so frustrated.
I know. And it shows that sometimes companies think they're providing a good service. But when you look at it from the customer's point of view, it's a completely different story.
It really shows that you can't make assumptions about what customers want. You have to map out their journey and see the process through their eyes.
And then they introduced this idea of spaghetti maps, which are really cool.
Yeah.
They're those messy diagrams that show all the twists and turns in a process.
They get their name from the way the lines representing the customer's path often end up looking like a big plate of spaghetti.
Right, but that mess can actually tell you a lot. It shows you where the process is breaking down.
Exactly. They suggest creating 2 spaghetti maps. One for the current state of the process and one for how the process could be improved.
I love that. It's a really visual way to show the impact of process improvement.
It is.
But what about the people involved? How do we make sure that everyone is on the same page and knows what they're responsible for?
That's Chapter 10, RACI Matrices. This is where we clarify roles and responsibilities. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed.
It's like a cheat sheet for figuring out who's in charge of what.
Exactly. And the important thing is to have just one person accountable for each task.
Right, because if everyone's in charge, then no one's in charge.
Right. It's about having clear ownership. And the book uses the expense payment process to show how you can assign RACI roles for each step. It's really helpful to see how they break it down.
I remember that. And they also share that story about a company where their RCI analysis showed that no one was accountable for anything because they were trying to be too collaborative.
It's so important to use these RCI matrices to streamline decision-making and make sure things are as efficient as possible. And that brings us to Chapter 11. Enterprise risk management and process mapping. That sounds pretty intense.
It does sound pretty serious.
It is. This is where process mapping becomes a strategic tool that helps organizations manage risk.
Okay, so it's like having a risk radar that scans the process for potential problems.
Yeah. And they talk about the core components of enterprise risk management, or ERM.
Which are things like internal environment, objective setting, event identification, risk assessment, risk response control activities, information and communication and monitoring.
You got it.
That's a lot.
It is, and it's a really comprehensive way to approach risk management. And the authors explain how process mapping can be used to support every single one of those components.
Wow. I'm starting to see how process mapping is so much more than just improving efficiency. It can also help organizations avoid major problems.
Exactly. It helps you see potential problems before they happen. And sometimes the same event that poses a risk can also be an opportunity.
Interesting. So it's about having a balanced perspective and understanding both the challenges and the possibilities.
Right. And they talk about how important it is to gather information about the company's culture and how they handle risk.
Okay.
They recommend asking open-ended questions during interviews to get a sense of how people feel about risk management.
So it's about understanding the tone at the top and whether there's a culture of transparency around risk.
Exactly. And they also talk about objective setting and making sure everyone in the organization is on board with those objectives.
So it's not just about what management wants to do. It's about getting input from people at every level.
Right. And they emphasize aligning objectives with the company's risk appetite.
Which is how much risk the company is willing to take on.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between being ambitious and being careful.
It's a lot to think about. We've covered a lot in this chapter. It's clear that process mapping is super important for enterprise risk management. But before we move on, what stood out to you the most from all these chapters? What was the most insightful or surprising thing?
You know what really struck me was how well the book explains everything using real stories.
Yeah.
Like the Pinocchio analogy, the Greenies, anecdote, and Sally's experience with We Train You. It really brings it all to life.
I agree. And it's not just dry theory.
Right.
It really shows you the human side of process mapping.
Hmm.
And speaking of stories, I'm curious about Chapter 12. Where do we go from here? It's interesting that they saved that for last.
It kind of feels like the end of a movie, where you see how everything turned out.
Yeah.
This chapter is all about the long-term value of process mapping and how we can use it in lots of different areas.
They talk about controlled self-assessment, which seems like a good way for teams to take ownership of their own processes.
Yeah. It's about creating a culture of continuous improvement. Imagine a team getting together, looking at their process maps, talking about what's working, what's not working, and coming up with solutions.
I love that. It's like a team huddle where everyone contributes to the game plan. And the book talks about re-engineering processes.
Yeah.
It's not just about mapping the current state. It's about actively looking for ways to make things better.
Right. Process mapping gives you the information you need to decide how to re-engineer things.
Yeah.
It's like having a blueprint that shows you how to renovate a building.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And they talk about using process maps for training new employees,
Oh, yeah.
which seems so much more effective than just giving them a huge manual to read.
It's like having a visual guide that walks you through every step.
Exactly. It makes it so much easier to understand.
It does.
And they suggest including management in the training,
Oh, that's so smart.
which I think is a really good way to bridge the gap between the people who design the processes and the people who actually do the work.
Yeah. It helps everyone understand each other better.
Okay, I have to bring back the filmmaking analogy one more time. The authors compare the completion of a process mapping project to the end of a film production. Everyone goes home, the film gets edited, and then it's ready to be released.
But a good movie often leads to sequels and spin-offs.
Yeah.
And the same is true for process mapping. A successful project should be just the beginning.
Right. You should inspire more improvements all over the company.
Exactly. It's like throwing a stone into a pond and watching the ripples spread out.
I like that. And the authors encourage us to keep that momentum going, to never stop looking for ways to improve.
Yeah. Make process mapping a part of everything you do.
Okay, now we need to go back to a chapter we skipped earlier,
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 6, Analysis.
Okay.
This is where we really dig into the process maps and try to find those insights that can help us make things better.
It's like panning for gold. We've gathered all this raw material. Now we need to sift through it and find the valuable nuggets. The authors give us a framework for analyzing the maps. We start by looking at the inputs and outputs.
And it's not just about the outputs we expect.
Right.
We also have to consider the unintended consequences.
Exactly. Those can be good or bad, but we have to be aware of them. And then we move on to analyzing the transformations. Those are the actions that happen within the process.
Okay.
That's where we can find bottlenecks, inefficiencies, and areas for improvement.
They say it's important to look for delays, rework, and handoffs.
Yeah, those are all things that can slow down the process.
And make it more expensive.
Exactly. Their section on delays is really good. They talk about how delays can build up and affect the whole process.
Right. It's like when there's an accident on the highway and it causes a traffic jam for miles.
That's a great analogy. You have to fix the accident, not just the individual cars. And they also talk about analyzing cycle times, which is how long it takes to complete a task or a process.
If you know the cycle times, then you can figure out where you're spending the most time and money.
Exactly. It's about finding the bottlenecks and streamlining them.
Okay. I want to go back to customer mapping for a minute because I think it's a really cool concept.
Okay.
I love how the authors dedicate a whole chapter to it.
It's so important to remember that the processes we design should be for our customers, not just for us.
Right.
And they start by explaining how customer mapping is different from process mapping.
So they're both valuable tools, but they have different purposes. It's kind of like looking at the same landscape through two different lenses.
That's a great way to put it. Process mapping helps you understand how the process works internally.
Okay.
But customer mapping helps you understand how the customer experiences the process. And they give us a framework for doing customer mapping, starting with defining the customer's job to be done.
Which means figuring out what the customer is trying to achieve.
Exactly. Like, what problem are they trying to solve? Once we know that, we can figure out what steps they need to take to get there, and then we can map out those steps, just like we map out a business process.
And they use that obtained training example
Yeah.
to show how it works. They walk us through the steps a customer might take to find and sign up for a training course.
Yeah.
And it really highlights those moments where the company might not be meeting the customer's needs.
And Sally's experience with We Train You is a great reminder that we can't just assume we know what customers want.
Right. We have to actually map out their journey.
We do. And they introduced this cool tool called spaghetti maps to help us visualize the customer journey.
I love spaghetti maps.
They're really simple to understand.
They're basically a visual representation of the path a customer takes through a process showing all the twists and turns along the way.
And all the handoffs.
Right. And they're called spaghetti maps because the lines often end up looking like a big, tangled mess of spaghetti.
They do. But even though they're messy, they can be really helpful because they show you where the process is breaking down.
It's like trying to untangle a string of Christmas lights to find the one that's burnt out.
That's a great way to think about it. And they recommend making 2 spaghetti maps, one that shows how the process works now and one that shows how you want it to work in the future.
I love that idea. It really shows you the impact of your process improvement efforts. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about Chapter 10, RACI Matrices. This chapter is all about clarity and accountability.
It is. It's about making sure everyone knows who's doing what.
And that helps to streamline decision-making.
Right. RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed.
It's a way to assign roles and responsibilities within a process.
Exactly. And the most important thing is to make sure that only one person is accountable for each task.
Because if everyone's accountable, then no one's really accountable.
Right. It's like that old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth.
Mm-hmm.
The book uses the expense payment process as an example of how to assign RACI roles.
Right. And they also tell that story about a company where the RCI analysis showed that no one was accountable for anything because there were too many people involved in every decision.
It's a good reminder that collaboration is important, but you also need to have clear ownership. And that brings us back to Chapter 11, Enterprise Risk Management and Process Mapping, which is where things start to get really strategic.
Yeah, that one sounds intense.
It is. It's about using process mapping to help organizations identify and manage risks.
So it's like having a risk radar that can see potential problems before they happen.
That's a great way to think about it. And the authors talk about 3 different ways to apply process mapping to enterprise risk management, or ERM.
Oh, tell me more.
The first way is to create a high-level map of the entire ERM process. That gives you a big picture view of how the organization handles risk.
But it doesn't give you a lot of detail.
Right. It's like a map of the whole forest, but you can't see the individual trees. The second way is to map out each component of the ERM process individually.
Okay, so that's like zooming in on the trees and looking at each one in detail.
Exactly. That lets you analyze each component much more closely. And the third way is to combine related ERM components and map them out together.
So that's like seeing how the trees in the forest are connected to each other.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And they give us an example of how to apply process mapping to the internal environment component of ERM using the integrity and ethical value process.
So it's not just about managing financial risks or operational risks. It's also about managing risks related to the company's culture and values.
Right. And they emphasize the importance of gathering information about the internal environment. You know, understanding the company's culture, the tone at the top, how they handle risk. They recommend asking open-ended questions during interviews to get a sense of how people feel about risk management.
It's about creating a culture of transparency around risk.
Exactly. And they talk about objective setting and how important it is to involve people from all levels of the organization.
Right, so everyone feels like they have a voice.
Exactly. And it's important to make sure that the objectives are aligned with the company's risk appetite.
Which is how much risk the company is comfortable taking.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance between being ambitious and being cautious. And then they talk about event identification, which is about identifying anything that could potentially impact the company's objectives.
So it's about looking for both threats and opportunities.
Right. They recommend getting input from people all over the organization so you can get a wider range of perspectives. It's like having a team of scouts looking out for potential problems and opportunities.
I like that analogy. So what about risk assessment?
Risk assessment is all about analyzing the events you've identified and figuring out how they might affect the company. They talk about the importance of considering both the likelihood and the impact of each event.
So likelihood is how likely it is that the event will happen.
Right.
And impact is how bad it would be if it did happen.
Exactly. It's about understanding the odds and the stakes. And they give us an example of a process profile worksheet for the risk assessment process. They also talk about the difference between inherent risk and residual risk.
What's the difference?
Inherent risk is the level of risk that exists before you do anything to manage it.
Okay.
Residual risk is the level of risk that's left after you've implemented controls to manage it. It's about understanding how effective your risk management strategies are.
That makes sense. And they also talk about asking those insightful questions during interviews to uncover hidden risks.
Exactly. It's about digging deeper and not just taking things at face value. And then they talk about risk response, which is about developing and implementing strategies to deal with the risks you've identified.
So it's about actually taking action to address those risks.
Right. And they talk about four main strategies: avoidance, reduction, sharing, and acceptance.
Could you explain those a little bit more?
Sure. Avoidance means getting rid of the risk completely. Reduction means trying to make the risk less likely to happen or less severe if it does happen.
Okay,
Sharing means transferring some of the risk to someone else, like an insurance company.
I see.
And acceptance means acknowledging the risk, but deciding not to do anything about it.
Okay, so it's like having a menu of options for dealing with risk.
Exactly. And they emphasize the importance of choosing the right strategy for each risk based on the company's risk appetite.
Which is how much risk they're willing to accept.
Right. And then they talk about control activities, which are all about putting controls in place to mitigate the risks.
So those are the things you actually do to manage the risk.
Exactly. And they talk about three types of controls: preventative controls, detective controls, and corrective controls.
Did you go over those?
Sure. Preventive controls are designed to stop the risk from happening in the first place.
Okay.
Detective controls are designed to detect the risk if it does happen.
Okay.
And corrective controls are designed to fix the problem after the risk has happened.
It's like having layers of security to protect your assets. And they also talk about monitoring the controls to make sure they're working properly.
Yeah, it's not enough to just put the controls in place. You
Yeah.
have to make sure they're actually doing their job. And they talk about information and communication.
Which is about making sure that everyone in the organization knows about the risks and controls.
Exactly. And they emphasize the importance of clear communication channels.
So everyone knows who to go to for information about risk.
Right. And they talk about tailoring the communication to the specific audience.
So you're not overwhelming people with too much information,
Exactly. And finally, they talk about monitoring.
which is about making sure that the whole ERM framework is working effectively.
Right. And they talk about how you can use process mapping to support monitoring.
So it's about tracking your progress over time
Yeah,
and making adjustments as needed.
exactly. And they recommend using a variety of different monitoring techniques to get a complete picture of how well your risk management efforts are working.
Wow, we really went deep on enterprise risk management. It's amazing how process mapping can be used for so many different things.
It is.
And I think we've covered all the chapters now. What do you think?
Wow, it's been so interesting talking about this book, Business Process Mapping, Improving Customer Satisfaction.
I know, right?
It really is like a toolkit for anyone who wants to make their business run more smoothly.
I agree. We've learned so much
Mm-hmm.
from the basics of process mapping to how it can be used for risk management. But before we go, I want to talk about something the authors emphasize throughout the book: the human element.
Oh, that's so important. It's easy to get caught up in all the technical stuff, you know, the diagrams and the data. But we have to remember that it's all about people.
Yeah. They talk about the importance of building relationships with the people you're interviewing. Creating a space where they feel comfortable sharing their ideas.
Right. It's not just about getting information from them. It's about making them feel valued.
Exactly. And that's where active listening comes in. Really hearing what people have to say and understanding their challenges.
Yeah, and recognizing their expertise because they're the ones who are closest to the process.
Right. And the authors also talk about how important it is to involve employees in the process improvement efforts.
Oh, absolutely. They're the ones who know the process best.
Right. And they probably have some really good ideas about how to make things better.
Right. It's about empowering employees and giving them a voice.
It really is.
Mm.
And when people feel like they're part of the solution, they're going to be more engaged and more productive.
Yeah, it's a win-win situation.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into business process mapping, improving customer satisfaction.
It's been a pleasure talking about this book with you.
Likewise, I feel like I've learned a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm definitely going to try to apply some of these ideas to my own work.
Me too. And remember, process mapping isn't something you do just once. It's an ongoing process.
Right, it's about always looking for ways to improve. And the authors say that the best process maps are the ones that are actually used to make a difference.
So don't just create a process map and then forget about it. Put it to work.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into business process mapping. We hope you found it helpful. Happy mapping.